on the go with a few informal sharings. Michael will do the recap of yesterday. Michael is our co-convener of the network. He has been a good friend over the past few years in holding this together. With Dina and I, we now have Geraldine also joining him at the University of Ghana, where the network's secretariat will be based for the next 2 years. So you can see that we are working hard at the African expansion from our side, and Michael as well will be working on some of this, and we'll support each other as we grow this work. So we will be having a couple of meetings, and that's actually what I wanted to share with you. The one is that we have an amazing group of people, from East Africa, Southern Africa, and of West Africa, and we need to find time to connect with each other in a bit more structured ways, between the breaks. We're not going to have this very soon, so it's important, okay? We just wanted yesterday to kick off, and as you can imagine, my team has been very anxious that things need to be 100%, that the day goes as smoothly as possible, that people are settled, that people are comfortable, and that everybody feels part of this family and community that we are knitting together as a collective. So I will have, spaces between Michael, myself, and Dina, between 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock today. We'll be meeting with some of the Ugandan delegates. Then also setting up meetings tomorrow over lunch. And then Michael, myself, and the other team with regard to the new secretariat at the University of Ghana will also be meeting today. And so what I'm actually trying to say, the invitation is that I will be meeting with the Makerere group and with the Thabo group, and I will be meeting with other colleagues as well as we move ahead. If there's anybody else who would like to have a particular session with Michael, Dina, and myself, just approach us over tea. That in a space like this, we talk, people make presentations, but that relationality that Sharon spoke about yesterday, which is actually the lifeblood of any network, that can only happens through extending friendships and solidarities whilst we're in spaces like this. So whilst those gaps are filling up, there's enough time for us to connect with one another. So just give us an indication, if you want to have a kind of structured engagement with the three conveners. So by the time that we then go to Ghana next year, the things are in place, and we, of course, will then engage, with the networks that Thabo is beginning to set up, and that colleagues at Makerere University is also pursuing. So this is a warm invitation just to approach us and say, right, can we chat at 5 o'clock and so on, or whatever the time may be. And of course, I will also, because I'm not so sure whether the engagement that have been set up covered everybody, in terms of people wanting to engage with us. We're very, very grateful. The generosity that colleagues always extend, in the context of how we operate on our continent is always something, that moves me, just the way in which people come into the space. And of course, extending not only love and friendship, but also a commitment to hard work for what it is that we need to achieve on our continent. Yesterday also, we had the typical South African illness, and that is to be to focus on ourselves. So from today onwards, we will rejig and retune. But we thought, and I have to, of course, send out a watermark apology for that. But I have to just indicate that that for today we will retune those and we will rejig our attention to the broader African project, and Michael will also assist us in steering it in that particular direction. So many, many thanks for what I regard as a fantastic day yesterday. And of course, thank you again, for participating today. I think Thierry wants to say something about the exhibition, and then I'll hand over to Michael. Jenny? Oh, you don't?
Okay, we'll have to put them in just before lunch.
Okay, right. Mike? Thank you so much, everybody. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning. I'd like to add my voice to Andre's to thank you enormously for your participation. Thank you for being here. Many I have spoken to have expressed the desire to be with us, to continue with us on this journey. And many of you have said how excellent yesterday was, our first day. Thank you for the brilliant provocations and disputations. These are proving to be a critical, formidable, rewarding pedagogical method for our network, the ACUSAfrica. And I can just imagine scholars and students of the ancient African universities engaging in this kind of methodology prior to the advent of the modern university. Salim raised an important distinction yesterday between universities in South Africa and or South African universities. That's an important distinction. It's a distinction which is central to the work of our network. Namely, what kind of university is Africa busy running? Is a university tradition essentially a novel reality to our continent? Or have the circumstances of our history influenced the institutions we are running so much as to divorce them from our history, push them to the periphery, with their knowledge production not taken seriously? Herein lies the need for the critique and transformation that CUS engenders. And clearly, Salem's provocation, Nobu's response, and the discussions that followed yesterday present South Africa as a critical partner at the forefront of the CUS debate, which should extend to the rest of the continent, just as Andre has pointed out. Andre tells me that the East African Bloc is beginning to organize and have conversations in this direction, which is very much welcome. I'd like to see that in West Africa and other parts of the continent. In fact, we've been having discussions of even going beyond the language barrier. English, French. We did invite some Portuguese friends from Mozambique, but they couldn't come. So the efforts are underway to extend to the entire continent. A network of this nature must grow, it must develop, it must flourish. But critically, is CUS merely another discipline with a fixed kind of scope of inquiry or a field that informs the kind of university project we are engaged in, with reference to how biology, chemistry, mathematics, history, anthropology are read in our universities. Shouldn't it be a prerequisite for my sociology students to read Fanon, read Ibn Khaldun, as well as Kant, Durkheim? Shouldn't my students engage with the idea of the Atlanta School of Sociology and even come to realize that the preeminence of that school was edged out by the Chicago School because of race, wealth, and power? If my students knew this, perhaps they would engage more with what they have. And that's why Su Min's point yesterday regarding the self-reflexive solidarity in our Techno-Rational Times points to a very important beginning for us to have this discussion, the right direction of critical questioning, which is fundamental to the kind of conversation we should be having, not the kind of conversation we should not be having. Indeed, various disputants launched into such conversation, leading to Primesh asking the provocative question or calling us to a university that proceeds with aesthetics, if only we would pursue the common good. And you remember, the common good itself raised lots of arguments here. Lots of disputations on the common good. How is the common good related to language, convergence, reciprocity, that multiple forms of output we were asked yesterday? There again, one disputant asked the question, do we have universities in Africa or African universities? This is a recurring question. And that's what our network is really working out. What's the African university? We're going to hear about that this morning. This recurring question points to the fact that ACUSAfrica is set to fulfill an essential task, not only in launching us into further reflexive solidarities in Techno-Rational Times, but recentering the African university as such into our consciousness, an African heritage on which to build our universities on the ancient roots this continent has. And enshrined in that is critical thinking, critical thought. Universities that respond to the needs of this continent and help us out of our predicaments. That reflection is concretized in this morning's discussion. Let the disputations and provocations flow. Thank you very much.
Good morning, colleagues. Lovely to see everybody again, and thank you so much, Michael, for your reflections of yesterday's session and reorienting us today to the engagements that we're going to be having today and our commitments and connections across the continent and, in a sense, through time as well. I'll facilitate this morning's discussion, which centers the African continent in our discussions, and its universities and futures in our work. I'm honored to introduce our provocateur, Professor Takyiwaa, who is an emerita professor of African Studies at the University of Ghana. While we all no doubt are very keen to hear this morning's paper from you, I just must say that those of us who have shared accommodation with Takyiwaa have been incredibly lucky, because in addition to little snippets of intellectual sharing, we've also got to hear what an incredible orator you are, and I think we've all been in awe. So thank you so much. The space is yours.
So, good morning, everybody. It's good that you are all sitting down low. When I'm usually on this podium, like Prem, you can see that I'm vertically challenged. So it's good that I'm on a raised days and I can look down on all of you, feeling like God this morning. So I want to start by thanking the organizers of this colloquium for inviting me to be part of it and to speak on the topic of the African University in Techno-Rational Times. I also wish to thank all the speakers at yesterday's sessions for their excellent contributions, including you, the participants. In particular, I wish to thank Su Ming for her kickoff yesterday that set off the tone for our subsequent conversations, and for so excellently deconstructing the notion of techno-rationality for us. She has made my task much easier, although I shall return to aspects of it in the presentation. I also wish to thank Prem for the extensive use that I've made of his 2019 article, What is the University For?, in part of his presentation. I had thought he was still in Sharjah, UAE, and did not know that I would be enjoying his company at this colloquium. So, oh, good. It's even getting better. Yeah, no, I'm fine. I'm good. I feel like, I know there are Roman Catholic fathers in this room, but I'm beginning to feel like God this morning. So I have 7 provocations around the following. Is there an African university? Is the African university techno-rational? Can it keep it up? Then I look at the managerial university with the logic of the market and the private and public goods. The fourth one looks at metrics, rankings, and best practices, which is integrating the university into a system of output. And then I look at the technological fix, and especially issues that have arisen since COVID-19 and beyond. I also look briefly at the question whether the state is a threat to the university. And then I end by thinking of how we might reimagine freedom around issues of academic freedom in the mix above, and issues of responsibility and creativity. So yesterday, many speakers commented on the extreme crisis of globalization around the world, with the rise of the far right in several countries. And if you've been watching the news, this just occurred again in Israel. We also have the strengthening of fundamentalist orthodoxies and nationalisms, alongside severe economic and environmental crises, including the recent COVID-19 pandemic. These crises have also played out in several countries of the global south, and especially around Africa, where it has exacerbated and intensified existing inequalities, high unemployment and underemployment, especially among the youth, growing immiseration and poverty of large proportions of the population, rampant gender-based violence, rising homophobia and xenophobia. What have we found? What have we gotten in return from our governments and business leaders? And we might add, from our universities. On the side of students, we have seen growing impoverishment, the fees must fall, the roads must fall, the Gandhi must fall movements. On the side of faculty, where have the responses been? So this takes me clearly into the university in Africa, and I ask the question, what and where is the university in Africa? What is African about the university in Africa? Is it just geography or intellectual traditions and outlook? And I shared a piece with my disputants, a piece that I wrote 20 years ago when I was invited to a Ford Foundation retreat on envisioning the African University in the year 2050 that I would like, I could share with any of you who wanted. So if we, and like Michael just said, many of you were asking yesterday about this African university. And of course, we are contrasting this African university, what we see today, with the traditions that arose in Fez, in Al-Azhar in Egypt, in Timbuktu, which Shamil Hepi and Suleiman Bashirdian have so eloquently written about in their meanings of Timbuktu, where we find real African intellectual histories and traditions. And as Walde, Georgis, and Dovenspek 2013 point out, in terms of the purpose of higher learning and pursuit of knowledge, indigenous forms of learning in pre-colonial Africa bore fruit in building various African civilizations, transferring cultural identity, and maintaining coherent ways of life on the continent. Moreover, these indigenous forms of learning used to be sources of local autonomy, formation of social elites, and institutionalization of culture. Local institutions, including institutions of higher learning, used to be products of societal dynamics continually shaped by the interaction of societal needs. The roles of these institutions of higher learning spaces were constructed by African societies, and they predominantly served and were devoted to religious, philosophical, moral, medical, and other studies to meet the demands of local people. Could we say that of our universities of today? Now we know that these indigenous African knowledge systems and learning spaces were disrupted and in some cases destroyed and disappeared with a history of wars over slave trades and the coming of European powers as early as the 15th century in Africa. So we can say that the educational evolution of Africa has been disconnected from its historical past, and new exogenous models of institutions, which were not along African roots, were imposed through colonization. Fast forward to the 19th century, and you have people like Edward Blyden writing about the West African University. And as Prem put it yesterday, it was very much a race question. And we can find parallels in Southern Africa also, the kind of demands for an African institution where African, and when we look at Blyden, in the 1850s, he was calling for a university where African teachers from both hemispheres, remember, he was originally from the Caribbean, and he had migrated first to Liberia and later to Sierra Leone. So he was talking about African teachers from both hemispheres, including Muslims from the interior, would teach students not to copy European models, but to develop their own originality. And he noted that if the people were ever to become fit to be entrusted with the functions of self-government, if they were ever to become ripe for free and progressive institutions, it must be a system of education adapted to the exigencies of the country and race. And many of our nationalist leaders were inspired by people like Blyden, and of course before him by Dr. Africanus Horton. So we know again, as Prem reminds us, that in Africa, the birth of the modern university accompanied the wave of nationalist independence movements that swept through the continent in the aftermath of the Second World War, with the promise of development underwriting its public commitments. And you find, let's say in the case of the Gold Coast, when it was like one university for the whole of West Africa, like in East Africa, Makerere, etc., the people of the Gold Coast said, no, we will pay for our own university. So it's part of these African modernities, you know, where having such institutions were part of the assertion also of being modern and wanting to development. A lot of the histories of such institutions have been traced in the work of Kodesria's work on higher education in Africa, with scholars like the late Kamdawiri, and then you have Olukoshi, Zeleza, Ibrimasal, Mamdani, Bashir Dian, all looking at these histories. And in Kamdawiri, for instance, in his 1990 paper, traces 3 generations of intellectuals and the important work that was done in many parts of the continent in the 1960s and 70s with the Ibadan School, the Dar es Salaam School, and even to some extent, the Legon School of History. And then you have Nkrumah, who founded my own Institute of African Studies in 1963 with a seminal speech on the African genius. However, institutes such as mine were seen as a threat to the established Cambridge tradition, and I could bore you with the many attempts in the history of my university where the institute has been sought to close down. You know, it's like, why do we need an Institute of African Studies in an African university? And sometimes we're told, oh, but the students, it's too crowded. They need space to learn computers, so and computing skills. So why have the only semblance of Africa in your university on a university campus? And yet we know that we have long histories, long traditions and knowledge systems which are, to a large extent, completely connected to what is happening. So we could say, almost without fear of contradiction, that the universities that we have are implants with catchment areas, countries, regions. They are territorialized universities, like our national carriers, where they have managed to survive. And it is very rare to have continental outlooks in our universities. If we were to ask, who and what do our students learn about? Yesterday, Prem was talking about Abiola Irele, Aimé Césaire. Michael was talking about Fanon. How many West African thinkers are taught in South African universities and vice versa? We have the issue of language, a perennial issue of language. And I think yesterday, the gentleman up there from the HSRC was picking up the question of language. Mamdani, for instance, has argued in his article in the New Left Review on the African University about Stellenbosch as the consolidation of Afrikaner power, complete with language. And yet, perhaps with the exception of the University of Dar es Salaam, where even there, Swahili is not fully hegemonic, we have continued with our French and Portuguese and our English universities. We could talk about our researches. What researches do we prioritize in our various universities? Who pays for it? What is our relation to society? How do we reflect the crisis at different levels that our societies are going through? How do we reflect these daily struggles and aspirations in our teaching, research, and engagement? How does the university intervene when we consider that we have the luxury to be on campus and be paid, however inadequately, to just think. How do we connect to or reflect transformation on the continent? And yesterday we heard a lot about the attempts at transformation. In many of our universities, people don't think that there is anything to transform. We are okay. If we should transform to more of the Western ideal. And since I've been here, I just read an email from my university where it was proudly announced the council has agreed that on a framework for using metrics to promote professors. So we are arriving, right? And it is really ironic. There's a university in Ghana that was set up in the 1980s called the University of Development Studies. It was meant to be a regional university to deal with the problems of the 3 or 5, now 5, poorest regions in Ghana. And it was meant to solve the problem of relevance. And yet, work that I and several other people have done suggests that those other universities want to be proper universities. They don't want to be University for Development Studies, university for this. So we get to the 1980s where, the World Bank does its rates of return on education and claims that the rates of return on primary education were higher than those for higher education. And together with the crisis that our countries were going through, this led to de-investment in higher education, which intensified in the adjustment years. And yet, by the end of the 1980s, the World Bank itself is finding out from the experience of the Asian tigers that they got there because they invested in all levels of education. So how do you walk back this talk? And then you find the foundations and the corporations entering at the end of the 1990s with the revitalization of higher education in Africa. Wits, Cape Town, Makerere, Legon, MacArthur takes over Nigeria completely. But this revitalization of higher education comes with the market logics and techno-rationalizations. This is also the period where the reign of hitherto public universities in most of Africa gives way to the entry of private universities and religious universities, often focused on a narrow set of disciplines, the liberal arts or parts of the liberal arts if you are lucky, ICTs, nursing, entrepreneurship, theology. These are full fee-paying universities, but they begin to make demands on the state that they are also citizens and they also pay taxes, and the state should expend some of its returns on them. So I don't have the time to go into whether the African university is fully techno-rational. It will come out. But what we find is that we know that, in general, the character of higher education in Africa has been to abstract its methods, contents, and debates from Europe. And if we get to the Kant's question about what is the Enlightenment, we know that he was grappling with processes around what it meant to know, the basis of legitimizing knowledge, and struggles over authority, epistemology, and even ontology in European or German society. But in Africa, we take many of these head-on without really taking our surroundings as the starting point in rethinking the global. And what it means is that whereas in concrete terms, techno-rationality raises questions about the relationship between the academy and society, about whether the relationship should be negotiated on an ongoing basis, subject to the time's prevailing social questions, or whether they are givens that are limited to technicist solutions from experts. In Africa, we have failed to really get on board with these things. So issues around race, class, and gender exclusions are often just seen in terms of greater access and representation without getting into the very deep structural issues in our societies. So by the end of the structural adjustment period, if you agree that there was ever an end to it, we find that the market logic is driving the functioning of universities on the continent. And in the post-1990s, many African countries restructured their university curricula and training programs to meet what was called market requirements and adopt the entrepreneurial spirit. So the traditional model of the public university gets readjusted, and you find in places like Makerere, you find public universities with increasingly public wings, what Mamdani has called scholars at the marketplace. And these have intensified in several other universities, especially in the elite disciplines, medicine, engineering, etc., and business schools, where you have private wings within public universities offering credentials for those able and willing to pay. And you could even have private companies registered within university centers who take and market spin-offs. So just last week, I happened to be on the road, and I was amazed to find that in my own university, Toyota and the University of Ghana have an engineering training center tucked somewhere on the outskirts of the university that nobody really sees. So basically, our institutions have become what could be called catch-up institutions with no critique. The issue, we use the term best practice as the norm. Best practice from where, from who? And we can ask, who does the university serve? And I return to it again and again. How do universities as institutions deal with and even more challenge the inequalities within society, and as Nobu reminded us again last night, in the universities themselves, because our universities are also places of power and privilege. So I move on to briefly to look at the managerial university and academic freedom. When we think of a university, academic freedom, autonomy are seen as hallmarks to teach and conduct research, albeit in an ethical and responsible and responsive manner. In Techno-Rational Times and under the logic of the market and managerialism, the university is increasingly viewed as a corporation. So again, in my own university, there used to be a sign. This is a public university, and there's a sign, private university, keep off, okay? And it was very hard for public transport to come in and out of the university, even though most students and workers in the university did not have access to their own private transportation. So the university is increasingly viewed as a corporation, with the vice-chancellor as a chief executive or chief operating officer. And this logic increasingly imbues a vice-chancellor with executive powers, shifting the standard way of decision-making in universities from community-based committees of peers, academic boards, senate, convocation, etc., to corporate modes of governance, where the business and executive committees meet in conclaves to take decisions or to override decisions taken by committees. We also have an emphasis on making courses more marketable to corporations, etc. And it leads to the mounting of short courses for a fee, with the threat that disciplines or courses that do not get enough of a buy-in could be discontinued. And we've seen mergers of departments, right? So fields within disciplines that can be attuned to businesses and corporations, such as analytic, philosophy, or bioethics, get promoted compared to classical philosophy or emphasis on ontology or epistemology, impinging on the freedom to teach. For me, this reached a high point in the University World News, the global edition of about 3 weeks ago. I read an article on UK universities where there is something issuing from the Board of Education that Departments, universities whose graduates cannot find work after 2 years are to be penalized. And we also read about the NYU, the New York University professor, whose students were failing in the math class, and he was then asked to leave. In this case, he was a retired professor, so there's also the ageism in it. So if you only teach history, if you teach courses that cannot be immediately marketed, and when I read about the throughput ratio in South Africa, if this kind of logic were to be applied, I don't know how long Andre could keep his post with, with students not finding courses, work within 2 or so years of graduation. And yesterday, was it Mtiti who was talking about the issues around graduate unemployment and how they're often put back on universities. Why are you not training students to be each one an entrepreneur? I mean, why are professors not entrepreneurs themselves? I mean, why bother to train your students? But larger structural issues of the economy are just put on universities, and suddenly we must retrain and do things. So we also have mentioned the buzzword of best practice, and then increasingly the issues around metrics and promotions. You must publish in a journal with an impact factor, okay? But we know that these journals are not innocent, that you must you must pay to get published, and there are many questions around journals, just the Elsevier and those kinds of family corporations with their sons and grandsons, So we are increasingly integrating our universities into a system of output. And then, of course, there is a big ranking issue. Who gets ranked? How? And yet, recently there was a scandal around Columbia University and how for many, many years they have been tweaking. That's a polite word. It's like an accountant fiddling with the books. So they were maintaining the number 2 or so after Harvard and Yale. And so this year they have pulled back. So this is not just an innocent issue about who gets ranked, And this is also part of the trend towards quantification, because I was looking at the methodology of how the ranking happens. How many times must you be cited and all of those things. So we've got this trend towards quantification in both the natural and the social sciences. And technology has a lot to do with this. And we found these issues of technology came to the fore in the recent COVID-19 crisis, where unprepared as many of our universities were, we were being dragged into the technological age. And yet we see that technology is not a neutral tool. It embodies a set of assumptions about what technology can do. And we know that, of course, the uses of technology predated the pandemic, but intensified during and after it, So again, since I don't teach anymore, I get my emails and I see the younger colleagues, and they spend all their time on Sakai and, all these trainings for online programs. They just run around. And I wonder, when do these young people really get time to sit and think and carry out their projects? So they've become almost like administrators, just running around doing all of these things. And there are companies that are making a lot of money from these programs. There is a company called Quality Matters. Since South Africa is often ahead of the pack, I don't know if it has arrived here, but you can virtually record your lectures and everything, put everything online, be sitting there and just finding out who enters and does not. So everything is structured for you at a cost, okay? And it also reduces everything, So I'm waiting for Prem to reduce all his ideas into these programmable courses. And you attain a Quality Matters certification for developing a series of highly standardized courses. So basically, you really are not needed, right? You could have a very efficient robot that will take the students through all of this. So we do face real problems of exclusion, and often when you hear the debates, it's as if, oh, it's about a technological gap if we just have the technology. But once again, do we control it? What is the content of all of this? But we're going glibly along with this. There are also the issues of anonymity and privacy issues, the vast data that is being generated, and along with some of our methods, the data on vulnerable populations, who is targeted. There's the issue of digital humanities that I don't have time to go into. We also see many institutions investing in artificial intelligence research. All of these new things, they are very necessary for healthcare delivery and data analytics. But again, what happens to issues of data protections in contexts where there are no legislations or policies covering AI use? One of the issues in our universities is also about the governance of our universities and the attempts to control our universities. In Ghana, we had a public universities bill which was defeated last year, but which we hear is coming back again. So it's back to transformation, state attempts to transform the universities, So some of it is positive, but some of it is sinister. And we would do well, in the 1970s, the Burkinabe historian Joseph Kizebo had this ironic phrase that universities were not allowed to debate or discuss. There was a sign on the door which says, "Silence, development in progress," okay? So we're so busy trying to get development that we must not talk about it, And some of these things have a kind of cyclical way of going around and coming back again. I see that I'm being looked at, I'm being approached, so I'll try and wind up. So I think that clearly there is a sense that all is not well in our universities, that they have not, whatever the intentions, that they have not lived up to them. The language question still serves as, a barrier. Yesterday, again, the generational issues, the racial exclusions, class, fees must fall, all of these things. And then we also have the huge societal issues, which are not really separate from us. They impinge on us. They affect who graduates, in what time, the conditions under which people study, etc. And it is clear that we really cannot go on like this, especially as our societies are overwhelmed by both the social, economic, and environmental crisis. So how do we undo this national narrative of a university yoked to some undefined goal of development, or development that is going very wrong, and the corporate dominance that is taking over many of our universities? How do we begin to reimagine how else our universities could be? Where are those kinds of reflexive solidarities that we were talking about yesterday? How do we make the connections? And what is our imagination? I think, was it Prem or Sumin, the issue about the idea of the university, that we must not lose sight that the university is not just bricks and mortar. It is a space. It is a space for thinking, for imagining new possibilities, for reflecting, but often also going beyond this. And especially in this, our future, where everything is about STEM, science, technology, engineering, maths. Maybe they add an A to it and it becomes STEAM, where the humanities are just bled out, unless they can be seen to serve some corporate demand. How do we reimagine these are universities where we deal with both material but also theoretical and conceptual issues, where we know that we do not live in a vacuum. We talk about the global south, but it is like a phrase. I have colleagues who also work who are Indian, and then I go to these seminars and we are talking interminably about Derrida and all of these, and they know nothing about African thought and vice versa. Very few Africans know anything about Indian thought. Whatever we do are mediated. We don't have centers where we can learn about even the Chinese firsthand until they bring you a Confucius Institute that is already made. But these kinds of independent institutions, we don't know anything. We don't have centers for Middle East studies, Arab studies, all of those kinds of things. Yes, now we have a Center for European Studies, etc., funded by the Europeans. But how do we really, truly engage so that the global south becomes a reality where we are really discussing, sharing ideas, and the global south just doesn't become some block, opposed to the global north, or the critiques of Minolo and co. How are they informed by our own realities, before we take them on, whether they're talking about decolonization or decoloniality, etc. So it's a real challenge, and those answers are not going to come from governments. They have to come from us. We cannot imagine that a Minister of Education is either knowledgeable or interested in such issues. It is up to us to find ways to put these issues on the table, to also open up. We teach. We have a lot of power. Yesterday I was reflecting on, not Noble, yes, you, the lady in pink, in our class, yes, you. No, don't turn, I'm talking to you. So in our classrooms, and I was thinking to myself, so I'm a lawyer, I'm trained as a lawyer, I've practiced as a lawyer, and then I go and I work in an Institute of African Studies, and I confuse everybody, and they say, but you're a lawyer. I say, yes. You practice law, yes. So what are you doing in an Institute of African Studies? And I said, where should I be, So if I had done African Studies and I had become a lawyer, I would have been congratulated, okay? So it's almost like a woman marrying down, right? But I used the space that I had to do what I liked in the classroom, okay? So I used to have students. I used to teach in the evenings, and then you can imagine me 40 years ago. I was under 30 then. And then I'll be walking behind the students, and I'll pick up some of what they're saying. It's the dark, they don't see me, and then they say, but we thought we were going to take a class in African Studies, and we're going to learn about women's beads and things. And here we are being introduced to issues of African debt, the debt question and all of those things. So I'll pick it up, and then the next time I'm in class, I say to them, hey, there's still time to drop the class if you want, But if you think you're coming to learn exotica in this class, forget it. You've seen the outline. This is what I'm going to teach, okay? So what I'm saying is that we should use our spaces more creatively, imaginatively, and responsibly to really introduce our students to issues that matter, to connect them, especially where we feel that they are not getting it from other classes, so that we grow a new batch of students who can be more audacious, given all the limitations that Sumin was talking about these information communications that really cut you off from any kind of community. How do we recreate community in our universities in an imaginative and responsible way? Thank you very much.
wouldn't mind having the stand myself, to be honest. Thank you so much, Takyiwaa. I think some real challenges there for our active engagement, and it's going to be lovely to hear the provocations now. Just a few fragments I was pulling out towards the end. All is not well in our universities. The societal issues are not separate from us. How do we undo the national narratives and corporate dominance? How do we reimagine the idea of the African university? And then how do we truly engage independently to make decisions across the global south? It was really a lovely talk. Thank you so, so much. I'm now going to ask Thabo Mugume, who is the director of the Ubuntu Higher Education Research Center in Kampala, Uganda, to speak with us. Thank you. Do we have a tea break? I'm sorry, Thabo. It's my fault here, even though Thabo and I both went through the program before I walked up. So it's entirely me, colleagues. We're going to have a little bit of tea, talk, which will be lovely, so everybody can just swamp Takyiwaa right now. And then we will be back here at 11 o'clock to continue with the disputations. Thank you. 11, quarter past. Oi, back at 11:15. There were some lovely pastries there. Thank you so much to the Crochet team who have really been incredible over the past 2 days. Please come join us. Fantastic. All right. So we now have a decent period of time for discussing some of the responses, disputations, contributions to Takyiwaa's talk that we had earlier. And we have 3 people who are contributing today. As with yesterday, we will follow a process of each person speaking separately and then have questions and comments from those in the room and those online as well. So we're going to begin with Thabo Mugume, who is the director of the Ubuntu Higher Education Research Center in Kampala, Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you so much. When I was requested to speak, I wondered what actually to talk about in the context of the panel. And I decided to say me and myself with a couple of colleagues who just graduated with their PhDs, we had come up with the idea of creating a research center, a higher education research center in Kampala. So I thought, why don't I just share some of the ideas, the things we are planning to do, and then I can hear some criticisms and get some ideas on maybe how we can improve what we are planning to do. So the question then is, if we are to try and think differently in the way we understand the university in probably here in Africa where we are, how can a research center utilize, for example, Ubuntu as a philosophy to research the university? The center itself, it's just about 4 months old, still a baby. The intention, like I've said, is to conduct higher education research, in particular to contribute to our understanding of the university. And of course, here the attempt is to use indigenous philosophies to try and critically understand the university in Africa and thus contribute to the journey of becoming an African university. I'm saying that because most of the discussions yesterday were about the shift, and I think it was Salim's presentation where he indicated that we can agree that it's still a university in Africa, but there is a lot of work being done in South Africa, but also in other countries to try and shift to an African university. Okay. So Ubuntu, of course, in Nguni languages would be Umuntu ngomuntu ngabantu. There are a lot of debates about whether actually we can have a clear English translation of that. But the working definition in our dictionary is a human being is a human being because of other human beings. Now, of course, Lang has also argued that it's difficult. Legrand has argued that it's difficult to define Ubuntu in a standard form, as the meaning is interwoven in the different cultural practices and lived experiences of African peoples. In other words, every time you look at the concept, you have to consider the context. With this working definition, we can basically consider whether a university is a university because of other universities. How can our universities respond to such a question in their functions? But most importantly, how do students and staff view themselves or relate to one another as they forge institutional cultures and subcultures within the organization? And how can that inform, or those principles underpin research projects which help us to understand the university in emancipatory ways? Thus understood, Ubuntu articulates social interdependence and a deep-rootedness in the community. In Johannes' words, the African concept of Ubuntu indicates an inner state of almost complete humanization and is the essence of community and commonality. Hence, Ubuntu has the potential to contribute to multicultural education, moreover central to the concept of Ubuntu, and much like the philosophy underlying, for example, multicultural education, is that caring for others is a fundamental approach to life in all of its facets. Consequently, considering Ubuntu to study a university allows one to understand existing challenges and opportunities for caring for one another in a community such as a university campus. Of course, there are questions which have been raised or criticisms posed by scholars in attempts to consider ways of utilizing to study the university through Ubuntu. And Tacha Moka and Asli Lumumba raised two important questions. What are the theoretical considerations which characterize Ubuntu-inspired education, for example? What are some of the practical solutions that exemplify Ubuntu-inspired education in a university? So can the research conducted by Ubuntu Higher Education Research Center attempt to provide answers to these questions? Of course, Legrand highlights the need to realize that talking about Ubuntu means talking about a concept that expresses African values. These are values which allow for caring for the self and other human beings, while Thala adds that to be human suggests that one's conduct is guided by a respect for and tenderness towards other beings. It suggests a desire to protect and nourish other human beings. Therefore, to research the university, as we are trying to propose, one should consider the institutional position on caring, the institution's position on caring, and the kind of practices in place, which can be evaluated but also challenged through that kind of research. In other words, the research should contribute meaningfully to ongoing change within and among universities, from a university in Africa to an African university. While there has been criticism of how Ubuntu is applied to studies in some cases, Scholars such as Lesek and Eke have argued convincingly in the context of education that institutions like universities and the values they reflect should cohere with the cultures of those they serve. They highlight the need for cultural coherence, which requires that citizens or the university community should feel at home in the institutions that serve their needs, and that this requires that the everyday practices of universities and politics should be welcoming and familiar rather than exclusionary and alienating. Hence, a philosophy such as Ubuntu, in teaching black students, most especially if you are to refer mostly to the discussions we were having yesterday in the context of South Africa, has the potential to contribute to a welcoming study environment. So there are certain principles, of course, which we can extrapolate and use in a research project. For example, the core values suggested by, for example, Mbigi, Ubuntu identified as solidarity spirit, compassion, respect, dignity. Nkondo, they highlight some other values that are implicit in Ubuntu, such as kindness, generosity, benevolence, and respect for others. That's the emphasis that Ubuntu has the potential to deepen our disposition for compassion and caring. Values which are critical in creating a more caring university environment or an experience of care in a university community. So how can the research center then contribute towards understanding the experiences of students and staff in relation to these values, or any forms of operation as experienced by students or staff members, or marginalization? There are some suggested, furthermore suggested principles such as recognition of the self in the context of teaching spaces or learning spaces, recognition of the self and other, building positive relationships within learning spaces, getting students to work cooperatively, nurturing of the student's mind, and teaching from a position of love and care, referencing, of course, other emancipatory works such as Paul Freire's work, utilizing students' linguistic resources to promote meaningful learning. I think that's what also Prof. Referred to here, the question of language and what we were dealing with. So the question is, can we, in these research projects, try to understand how universities are responding to this, and whether this is actually impactful within the experiences of students and staff members. We are currently working on two projects. One is understanding university cultures in Uganda and how they impact institutional change. What logics inform institutional cultures within a particular university, and therefore social relations across campuses. Of course, noting that education is relation. Then the other project is trying to understand university student politics or governance and how this contributes towards developing student leaders, for example, as democratic citizens. Yesterday we were talking with Andre, and the question of language and how we conceptualize, for example, we were talking about, I think it was graduate attributes, and you were asking how we can utilize, for example, the capabilities work. You're saying you had looked at the capabilities work, and rather than asking or conceptualizing student graduate attributes, can someone rather conceptualize student graduate capabilities rather than attributes? Okay, in conclusion, we believe that it is critical for a center such as Ubuntu Education Research Center to adopt indigenous philosophies in our research about the university, because of the potential they possess to challenge the way we understand the university and how universities relate to the communities within and beyond. Ubuntu is one such philosophy. However, in addition to Ubuntu, the center intends to consider other indigenous philosophies as we study the changing university, from a university in Africa to an African university. Such philosophies include Ujamaa. I think Mtimi knows more about this, and The work already done mostly in Tanzania on the Swahili language and the Ujamaa communities, the implications of these communities on their universities. How can Ujamaa, as an indigenous philosophy, help us understand a Tanzanian university, or a university in East Africa, or a university or in Africa and beyond? Just to piggyback a bit on the next presentation, Takako will say something about Musizi, another indigenous philosophy that has already been presented, that's already going to be presented as being at the core of establishing a new university. So challenging the status quo in terms of conceptualizing and then implementing universities. We believe the research in the center has the potential over time to inform about how the university on the continent is changing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thabo. It's really exciting to hear at such an early stage in the formation of an institute, and now with Takyiwaa University, how some of the thinking is very, very different. And I guess in a way we're almost at a point of witnessing the conceptualization of something, which I think most of us are really interested in. All right, so now we're going to have Dr. Takako Manuh, who's an adjunct lecturer in the Humanities and Social Sciences at HSRC University in Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. First of all, I want to really thank everybody for this opportunity to be here. This is my first time visiting South Africa, and I've met so many amazing people from South Africa, Ghana, Uganda, Tanzania, all over the continent and all over the world, and it's been such an enriching space to be in, so thank you so much again for having me here. And it's also been a great opportunity for me to learn as much as possible, because what I hope to share in my presentation is how we are trying to apply many of these ideas and principles we've been discussing throughout this conference to a new institution that I'm helping to set up in Uganda called Musizi University. So if we don't want to be dominated by the techno-rational paradigm, what is the paradigm that we can create? How do we reimagine education? So I hope to share how we're practically trying to do this. I hope to share how we're practically trying to accomplish this, and I'm also open to any feedback that any of you may have. So I want to start with a Luganda proverb. I'm still a student of Luganda, so I'm not very good, but it's a tongue-twister proverb, and I'm going to share it with you and then tell you how it relates to us. So the proverb goes like this: Amazi kakulukutila jegali katakulukutilanga. Nedda mbade amazi kakulukutila jegali kakulukutide. So what this proverb roughly translates to is, does water flow where it has not flowed before? No, water will always flow where there were once riverbeds. So why I wanted to start with this proverb is that it captures what we're trying to accomplish. Just as it was shared by Prof. Takyiwaa and Michael earlier about how the tradition of education has been strong on this continent. Reassimilating indigeneity is not anything new. It's still there. It's still maybe a dried up riverbed, but how do we get this river to flow again? And that's what we're trying to accomplish with Musizi. So in thinking about this, we try to think about what kind of symbolism can we use around the university to help conceptualize what we're trying to accomplish, and what are some of the indigenous concepts in Uganda that we can draw inspiration from in building our idea. So I'll first share the meaning of the name Musizi. Musizi is a name of an indigenous tree in Uganda, and it's a very, very tall tree, traditionally planted in coffee plantations. And what this tree does is that because it stands very tall, birds will go to this tree for protection and hang out there, and then they drop seeds around the tree. And the seeds will turn into plants. So when you translate Musizi into English, it actually means the sower. Wherever this tree is planted, other plants will also flourish around it. And we love this idea because it represents an alternative approach to development, which is not about one person flourishing by themselves, but a person flourishing and enabling others to also thrive around them. And this is what we want to accomplish as a university, and also for our students, what we aspire our students to become. When thinking about indigenous concepts that we can draw inspiration from, one of the philosophical concepts in Uganda is something called Ubuntu Bulamu. And this is something that my co-founder and I wrote about in a book that was published recently on decolonizing higher education. So I'm going to quote from this chapter that we wrote. Ubuntu Bulamu, Buntu meaning humaneness and Bulamu meaning life, roughly translates to what keeps a human being alive. In other words, what makes us alive is being a true human being with a sense of responsibility to others' well-being. Ubuntu Bulamu can also be translated as humaneness is a part of life. In other words, regardless of anything, anyone who is alive is human and therefore must be accorded respect. Even if someone commits a crime, there is a sense of we see you for who you are outside of what you have done. So we wanted to turn to this concept as a source of inspiration for us, but we also see a big project ahead of us because in trying to bring in indigenous concepts into academia, there's a need to create language around it. It was mentioned yesterday by Suming that if we want to create a new culture, we have to create a new language. We have to be able to talk about it. So if we are trying to bring in Ubuntu Bulamu, which may be a bit under-theorized right now, how do we start articulating some of these core ideas and concepts in a way that others can understand? And then how do we apply these concepts to transforming our disciplines? So for example, if we want to apply Ubuntu Bulamu to humanizing, let's say, computer science, even in looking at how we approach technology, what would that look like? Applying Ubuntu Bulamu to the business field. So this is one project that is going to be a long journey, but something that we will need to undertake in order to achieve what we're trying to achieve at the university. So how are we trying to achieve all of this, and how are we trying to prepare Musizis from our university? I'm going to share some of the ways that we're conceptualizing our learning outcomes, like what is it exactly that we're trying to achieve with our students. And we conceptualize our learning outcomes in the same way that we do the university, as a tree. So just as a tree needs very strong roots in the ground to stay stable if a storm comes, human beings also need a strong foundation. So we start with the roots, helping students understand their roots and to understand themselves. Like, who am I as a person? Where do I come from? Where am I going? And what really shapes me as a person? And I think this also helps to combat many of the challenges that come with techno-rationality, where people are disconnected from themselves and may lack a sense of self-awareness, or may not even have the space in their mind to explore what that means. So we want to be intentional in our curriculum about being able to do that from day one. So some of the outcomes that we're trying to accomplish is helping students develop self-awareness, helping them think about how are they going to transform. They should come out as a different person when they come out of the university. So what exactly are they going to do in order to do that? What is their purpose? What is the point of their getting an education? Is it just to get a job and to be okay after that? Or is it to be able to make an impact? And then also giving them the space to explore indigenous knowledges, whether it's their own indigeneity or someone else's, learning from different cultures, being able to have the space to draw inspiration from that. So once we have the roots set up, now we come out from the roots and go out into the world, which is the trunk. And the trunk is about analyzing the world. So now we're interacting with the world and trying to understand, okay, this is who I am. So now I'm going out and I'm trying to understand the world that I stand in. So this is where we're looking at developing their communication abilities, collaboration skills. I know that Thabo mentioned earlier about the importance of cooperation, but being able to promote that through many team-based projects in our curriculum, through their research abilities, and looking at interdisciplinarity. So just like in the same way that African traditional education was very interdisciplinary, where all the different subjects were very much connected to each other, we want our students to be able to analyze societal issues in that integrated way. And then finally, now that you have analyzed the world, your branches are going out into the world. So what are you going to do with that? What kind of impact are you going to make? And there's many ways of doing that, but helping students through these different areas: entrepreneurship, taking a risk to start something new, innovation, leadership, and then global citizenship. So I just wanted to share how we're practically trying to accomplish this through just a few courses, and then I'll stop. And these are the core courses that we will we will require all of our students to do regardless of their major. So even if you're a science major, you will still take these core courses. So one of the core courses that we're trying to accomplish some of these objectives in is a course on storytelling. And it's a course about trying to articulate and understand what your story is as a person. Like, what are your inflection points? What has shaped you as a person? And then to be able to write that down and then communicate that to others. So empowering the students to be able to tell their own story is one course that we're going to do. Another one is a course on Ubuntu Bulamu. So because the concept of Ubuntu Bulamu, and maybe in many indigenous philosophies in Uganda, may be under-theorized, what we would like to do in this course is have the students generate the knowledge with us, find the knowledge with us. So maybe it's not documented, maybe it's not readily available, but through different projects where students will go out into the community, speak to their elders, learn about different traditions in their communities to help generate that knowledge and to start documenting it and co-creating that knowledge together through that course. And then finally, understanding Uganda is helping the students appreciate the local context that they're in from many different perspectives. So whether it's from a sociological perspective, political, historical, economic, being able to integrate all of those to analyze the current environment that they're in and understand it better. So this is just a quick introduction to what we're trying to do as a university in terms of humanizing higher education, how to make higher education more relevant, more grounded, and more empowering for the students involved, and our work in trying to help the river flow again. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to end the responses or disputations with Professor Uchenna Okeja, who is the head of the philosophy department at Rhodes University here in South Africa. Thank you.
Good morning. Yes, I'm happy you answered because it's important to feel welcome, you know. So if you hadn't answered, I wouldn't know that you want me to speak to you. So the university in Techno-Rational Times, when I spent quite, a reasonable time thinking about what Techno-Rational Times would mean, because it is essential. The concept is essential for us to understand where the university is today. I don't know what your own understanding of the concept is, but I'll try to leverage on my understanding of that concept to respond to some of the ideas that people have raised and also propose some of the perspectives I think we should be looking at when we want to talk about the university of the future in Africa, or the African University of the future. In my culture, we tell a lot of stories. So I will tell you a very little story as a prelude to the conclusion that I want to put forward. It won't be long, because I see many of you are tired. Okay, that is encouraging, because the interactive dimension is really very important, because it makes you feel alive, and it makes the conversation very interesting. So this story actually is very popular amongst the Igbo people, and Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian writer, also recounted this story in one of his texts. And it is the story of the lion and the tortoise. It's a fable. So there was this tortoise that was very troublesome. It always made sure he disturbed the lion, stole the lion's stuff, his food, just kept pulling at his tail. When the lion wants to grab the tortoise runs away. And this problem continued for some time. And one day, the lion was in the middle of nowhere in the bush. And then the tortoise didn't know that the lion was there. The tortoise was also there. And the lion grabbed the tortoise and said, "Now I finally got you. There is no one here, and you are totally just in my hands. I am going to put an end to all these troubles you've been giving me today, here and now." And the tortoise said, "Well, I accept my fate, but all I ask is that you give me just a minute or two so that I prepare for my demise." And the lion said, "Okay, I'm going to make sure you go nowhere, so I give you 2 minutes before I finish you off." And the tortoise went about, throwing things in the air, uprooting plants, throwing things around, scattering the whole place, went into a frenzy, literally. And the lion said to the tortoise, what do you think you are doing? What are you doing?" And the tortoise said, "I am doing this so that anyone who passes here tomorrow or any time will know that even though my carcass is there, the person will know that I gave it a good shot." That I fought gallantly. I didn't go down without a fight. So this seems to me to be where we are as people in African universities. We are performing incredibly, throwing things around, theories, decolonization, struggling, fighting everywhere. And when you ask what is the point, to say, we want to show these people that we are not just sitting down there. Now, this is interesting to me because when you look at it, I'm not too old, but since I became an adult, I see that the university in Africa is there. It's just there. Theories come and go, and we keep performing. Universities have multiplied beyond anyone's imagination, maybe 50 years ago. But our problems have not multiplied that much. But the interesting thing is that the universities have not contributed really to the creation of solutions to some of these problems. In fact, they have entrenched these problems as interminable discourses that help us to generate what we call esteem. So we become theorists of a particular kind, and you are happy to be a leading theorist of a very troubled society. I have published 1 billion papers. Have you read this and that? This is troubling. This is troubling. So, yeah, some people can actually do that, you know? So, we are productive, but are we creative? This is the question. So, I want to say that the way I understand the university in Techno-Rational Times is that this is a conceptual signpost to indicate that the university finds itself enmeshed in a very debilitating disorientation, cognitive and otherwise. So the question is, how did we arrive here, and how should we respond to this situation? So I can't tell you, I'm not a historian. We have a very important historian here that I know who can tell us a lot about the history of how we got here. But what I can do is very modest, to think with you about where we should be looking if we want to respond adequately to the conundrum. Now, okay, is my time up? Okay. Sorry. So, before I get to that point, you see that this challenge, this unique challenge that we find facing universities in Africa raises the question, how do you become global locally? Because the global arena is the playground for people who want to shape ideas and also want to generate conceptions of what it means to experience progress. So if you want really to do something that provides a kind of a direction in a way that matters, you cannot pretend that globalization has not happened and that it is not happening. So if this is the case, perhaps the issue then to the way to get to the point I think we should be trying to get to is to ask, how have we responded to this challenge of trying to be global locally? When you look at African music, for instance, today, you can say it is African music. Black Coffee is doing its thing there. The Afrobeat musicians are doing their thing there, Davido and all the rest of them. But when you ask, what is the essence of the Africanness of their music? You can't really point to one specific thing, right? It's a melange, it's a combination of so many things. And so, but they have been able to create something unique, something that travels, even though it is locally embedded. What is happening is that they are able to deploy the creative human imagination in a way that responds adequately to the situation they find themselves confronting. So I think that one way we can get to this point as scholars, as people in the university, is to try as much as possible to embody what I would want to call conceptual creativity, to be creative at the conceptual level. You know, we can't just continue to respond in the two ways that we have predominantly responded and hope that things will change. One of the two ways we've responded is by extrapolating ideas from so-called traditional African society to respond to the challenges of modern Africa. This is problematic because I often ask myself, do modern Africans think? Why must we always say it is this traditional, it's people that created these systems. So we should be creating and contributing to that and not just saying the African concept of Ubuntu. Yes, is important. I strongly believe in Ubuntu. I think it is the height of what we can become as human beings to tell ourselves the story that humanizes us. But there is a contradiction we can't deny, and we can't reduce it to the operations of capitalism, that somebody wants to take your cell phone and he doesn't mind killing you. You can't mobilize Ubuntu alone and say, hey, is Ubuntu? It's not the only way you can respond. You have to think about what is happening in the here and now, and you have to come prepared. So that thing of extrapolating from traditional society is good, but we have to take it a notch higher, and that is thinking in the present. The second predominant way we've responded is by adaptation of ideas from elsewhere. What Mamdani, the very fine scholar, has called theory by analogy. We keep adapting. So a French woman writes about X. We create our little African version of that. You know, the African African post-colonialism, African this and that. Previously, this is just a new iteration of something that has been happening. You know, previously when they wanted to talk about what is non-research, they called it ethno this and that, ethno-philosophy, ethno-botany, ethno-medicine. You know, now we have internalized this and we have made it into our own little versions, Afro this and that, Afro-constructivism. I'm not trying to say that those things are not important, but I'm trying to say that the critical nature of the challenge we should be dealing with cannot in any way be addressed by some of these very limited imaginations. So where do we then go from here? I think that we need to recognize the general problem of universities in Africa, which is that there is a contradiction that is entrenched at the core of the university in Africa. And this contradiction is a dialectic, a mismatch between achievement and value, the real world value that is created, you know. So if this is the case, we will understand that it is not because people are not clever or intelligent or anything that we are still asking the same questions 60 years after they were raised in African universities, but that we need something to happen, and that is to find a new orientation to thinking. You know, there is this very important philosophical question: what is orientation to thinking? When you say the university Techno-Rational Times, that is an orientation to thinking. Critical university studies, criticality is an orientation to thinking. This and that, different orientations to thinking. But what really, when we look at it from a detached perspective, if that is possible, what would be an adequate orientation to thinking? I don't have the answer, so you have to pardon me for not pontificating, because these days people ask you questions and you must provide answer. I don't know the answer myself. But I want to point out certain aspects of the question of orientation to thinking. The one is that thinking about universities within a space in the university is really a complicated and complex affair, because we are here thinking about the university, but we are in the university. We are dissatisfied, but we are at the center of our dissatisfaction trying to deal with it. So this is really something very fundamental, which is that to have an adequate orientation to thinking, we cannot presume that we'll have the luxury of stepping out of the context of our existence to imagine a neutral perspective. We are in it. We are like what Otto Neurath called people, sailors on a boat, on a leaking boat on a high sea. We must repair that boat while navigating our way on that high sea. There is no other context. We have to work with what we have. The second thing is that the approach of looking at the university from the point of view of utility is not just problematic, but could become productive. So when we say that the university should be doing X, Y, Z, universities are not producing employable graduates. What does that even mean? But, you know, it is not something to criticize and dismiss. It is something that is indicative of the anxieties of the moment. And we have to approach it from that point of view of an imagination of what the university could become. And the third thing is that independent practice that generates its own, thinking about the university as an independent kind of social practice that generates its own purpose is difficult to sustain, because there is a sense in which when people talk, they say, well, universities cannot become like training grounds or X, Y, Z. The universities generate their own purpose and this and that. I find that really very problematic, because it says that we know what the university can become. And we know because we know what universities can create. But over the years, we have seen that that is not true. We do not know. And we have to be humble enough and stop trying to be symbol pushers, you know. These things have won awards. I am very clever, more clever than you, and all that. That is not how to prepare people for the future. So, in a nutshell, then, telling the story of what the university can become, in sum, for me, is finding an adequate orientation to thinking. This is the task before us. Thank you very much.
That was quite a journey from the death throes of the tortoise to orientations. I'm standing on my tiptoes now. I don't know how that happened. Okay, lovely. Thank you so much to all of you for your contributions. We have time now to really engage and ask questions. Can I ask again that people introduce themselves by name so that the people can respond to you? All right. Pramesh, would you like to start? And then we'll go with you and there. Okay. Yes. Thank you, Pramesh.
Fascinating. You know, I want to just call attention to this word creativity that you put on the table. And I think, you know, the provocation really was pushing us to think about what we want to do with this word creativity, because it's around everywhere. In fact, you know, every committee meeting you go to, you're being asked to be creative. But I think there's a distinction that was drawn in the last presentation between the creativity that leads to the entrepreneur of the self, which is a speculative, and you know, Africans are being sold speculation again and again. Let's gamble, let's hedge our bets on what the future can be. You're going to get a, you know, what do you call it, a startup, and then you're going to, and so on and so forth. And that's a dangerous slide into a nowhere. But there's a creativity that is about the university's orientation, as you put it. And I want us to think a little bit carefully about what we might do with that word creativity in the second iteration, not in the first. I think we must guard against what is happening in that first iteration, which is, you know, the kind of slide into the death knell. The second thing is just to raise the question, you know, I mean, I know that the point about Mamdani's, you know, question around theory and so on, I wonder what one would do with Edward Said's notion of traveling theory. And, you know, in a sense, I would want African concepts to travel and to be tested and to be robustly put to work in other conditions. That's what humanism did for Africa. And Europe went to sleep and went to war as a consequence because they didn't take heed of a concept of humanism that was underway in Africa.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the presentations. My name is Geraldine. My question goes to the provocateur. The point has been made that the African university, as it is today, is disconnected from its past, disconnected from African knowledge systems. So how do we reconnect with Africa's past, and how would an African university reconnected with its past look like?
Thank you so much. Andre?
Thank you so much. And of course, again, you know, a wonderful start to the day. So great stuff, you know, Prof. Manuh, you know, Takaku, Tabu, and Uchenna. Good to see you in person, actually. We thought you would link up online. You know, the key question here came through, and it's for all four of you, just as a general idea. Pramesh argued about the fundamental, you know, centrality of aesthetic education and whether one can mobilize. Uchenna, you have had the notion of music, but of course there's also literature and art. Whether a form of the African university can be imagined via the proposition of aesthetic education that Pramesh put forward yesterday. Prof. Manuh, that's also, you know, for you and for Tabu and Takako, as a kind of practical formulation that sets the parameters within which that thinking that you are asking for, Uchenna, can take place. Okay, so that's the first one, because the idea that disciplinary knowledge should evolve from general knowledge, i.e. the Foucauldian thematics around savoir and connaissance, which has been taken further by Nabudere and Mudimbi, suggests that if colonialism has been so brutal in displacing general knowledges, it will be difficult for disciplinary forms of knowledges to emerge in its total African form. Because the general knowledges, like general knowledges around traditional medicine and so on, has been obliterated. And for any discipline to emerge, whether it's medicine or philosophy, it starts off with a general idea of knowledges that floats around within society that gets disciplined in various forms and then become the subject areas within which we specialized. It comes from that ground root onward. So part of the reason why we have struggled with the question of African knowledges is precisely because of the violence of that obliteration, because it is the void created by the obliteration of the general knowledges that makes the Africanization of knowledges so difficult. You see how we have struggled with IKS, né? Even with massive investments of funds. It just simply struggles to root itself as a legitimate knowledge formation. Of course, there's great work being done. You know about the work of Catherine Odora, Hoppers, and so on. But then, and here, of course, and I know Nomalanga hates this, so I apologize, you know, beforehand. We do have young scholars that are excavating. Uchena, and this is more or less a particular caution in the direction of traditional knowledges and see what we can do with it. There are forms of intellectual African traditions which have been obliterated by the colonial experience, and that requires and deserves forms of excavation because it never had a chance to land within our space of making sense of our social reality. And in our university, we have colleagues that works within disciplinary fields, excavating those intellectual traditions and making it work for the question of the now. You see, whether it's in sociology, whether it's in history, and there are some of them here as well. Now that, of course, we have to write it up sometime. You know, that's like the real decolonial work, you know, that students have been calling for since 2015 and 2016 as well. So we have to find ways of packaging it in ways that makes it palatable for us to see it as a response to the question of not only the now, but also the real and the future as to the trajectory in which our knowledge transformation and reconfigurations projects can work. You know, so there's a huge contradiction, or what can say a contestation with regard to whether we revisit the past simply because we want to do it and there's no value in it, or whether we want to excavate certain forms of intellectual traditions that simply never had the chance to blossom in our spaces. Okay?
Thanks, Andre. Yes, please, Simon. And then I hope we're okay to answer these and then do a few more. Would you like yours? Yeah, after Simon. Okay, and then we'll do one more afterwards and interact.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Simon Kofi Appiah from Ghana, from the University of Cape Coast. So just like Andre, my contribution is a contribution, and not so much a question, but there will be a question in there. Okay. And it goes precisely to where Andre left off. So I'm looking at things like what is popularly called the African palaver. And this is a Portuguese rendering of very important meetings that will take place in many African communities for dealing with very important social issues. And somewhere around the 1970s, I think 79 thereabouts, the United Nations constituted a study of this system of deliberation because they wanted to use it as a mediation strategy for situations of conflict and peace. And it was noticed that it was a very functional, very positive system of knowledge production and achieving consensus, achieving, if you like, communal knowledge. In the English dictionary, palaver translates as chatter, empty talk, meaningless, you know, wasting away of time in discussions that don't produce anything. I have been wondering why we have never developed a method of research aligned to what we now call African palaver. Now, if you go back into history, in the Roman tradition, they had what they call concilium. And so we have councils, we have, you know, and everybody respects those ones. But in African institutions, you have students conducting research using the so-called Delphi method. The Delphi method is in fact a watered-down system of the so-called African Palamba. So, again, going back to those knowledges that were not allowed to flourish. Why not talk about an African concilium? Because in ancient Rome, the patres familias was supposed to call a meeting of the extended family system to deliberate on all important issues that affected the welfare of that family and the community in which it lived. And this is precisely what we do in the so-called African Palambas. Now, I'm only referring to some of those sources that could allow us to develop knowledge according to African systems. But let's go back to the question of language. There are three areas in which language affects knowledge production in African universities. I look at the language of sources. I look at the language of teaching and learning, and I look at the language of commerce. Now, the language of sources, particularly for African history, is not to be found in European languages, or at least not in the European languages alone. Have we considered the place of Arabic as a source, if you like, of unadulterated African history? Because I think about 60% of African history lies in Arabic sources and not in European sources. So, the language of source, if we want an inter-African university language, should be considering the place of Arabic in knowledge development in African universities. May not be just Arabic, but this is a language of a source. Of course, we would want to produce a language of commerce that changes the culture of knowledge production in centers of learning. So that might be one or the other language. It might be an indigenous language in which people are brought up and so on and so forth. But this language may not always be the same as the language of sources. So yes, we need this African Renaissance. European Renaissance was to go back to reject school Latin and say, wait a minute. We don't want this scholastic books that just tell us it is A, B, and C. We want to go back and see what original Latin with Cicero and so on and so forth had to teach. And this was Erasmus. So the colloquium will begin as a result of a chase into this language of sources. An African colloquium must go back to a language of sources. We want to look for ourselves where we were left, where the roots of destruction. That is where we should go. And I think that in doing that, originality, African sources, Ubuntu, Ujamaa, and all these things are very, very important for a development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we have a... Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I am Ayanda Simai, here at Nelson Mandela University, Faculty of Education. Thank you, Prof. Takyiwaa, the whole panel. I'm laughing and smiling. I'm so happy with the progress of this colloquium because it has managed to come down to my level, the level of the ordinary person. You know, yesterday I listened so well when I heard the deep theories. You know, when you go to the classroom, you tend to forget. Because now we are dealing with the discipline that we are facing. It's been a good revival, but I'm happy now that we can even tell cultural stories. And you know what? English is so difficult. It's not our language. We struggle with English. Imagine learning and teaching science in English. I'm a science teacher. But now I'm raising one question, and thanks, Prof. Kit, for inviting me. My passion has been revived, especially when you touched the issue of indigenous knowledge systems. Now my question is specific. How do we, as we're here, as CUS, go back, Prof. Takyiwaa, to make the links that were there initially with society, because as the Western universities, we are now far removed from the real context of the people. How can we use this forum to form an African bloc? The second one is going to you, Prof. Uchiwa. I hope my pronunciation is quite good. You know, I don't want to mingle up or mangle your names. How can, you know with English and language. Now, how can we, because you said we should be creative, and are we creative? How can we use, again, the CUS to uplift the little creativity that we have done into our disciplines, so that it doesn't stay within my faculty, it doesn't stay within Nelson Mandela universities? Then we share, what are you using in your own African university, that we can form a block that talks to what has been created within the disciplines. Thank you very much. I think I've tried with my English. I think I'm there.
Thank you. Those 5 contributions were really, really interesting. If I can, I want to link the very first question on creativity with the very last one. They were constructed in different ways, but I think there's a desire there that would be really lovely to have a response. So the one was addressed particularly to you, Achena, and then the last one to you, Takyiwaa. So I don't know who would like to start in the sense of creative responses from aesthetic education, but also from the disciplines, beyond the disciplines, across institutions. How do we try to mobilize, in a sense, this opportunity?
I would have liked the story from Uchenna again. Thank you very much. This has been an exciting session. I think that in my presentation towards the end, I was talking about reimaginings, and I think that Uchenna came in quite nicely on that, because it is clear to all of us that the model is not working. This fixing the boat on which we are traveling on the high sea, right? It's leaking, and we could be submerged anytime. It also means that we cannot go to some stock reference of what we know to try to fix it. And this is where the creativity comes in. So when I hear issues about returning to the source, African traditions, I see it as a point of departure, not a destination. Okay? And it is important when you are talking. I mean, by the way, Nabudari was my professor. Okay? So this issue of this epistemic violence that has been enacted on our bodies, on our memories, such that there is no confidence. During the break, I was reminded, there's a university in Madrid, a private university, and they were doing some programs with young African entrepreneurs. They had a Center for African Studies. So I got invited a couple of times to talk to these young people. And I was trying to use, how shall I call it? Things from the African past to inspire young African entrepreneurs of today. Because often they enter the field feeling that they had nothing. There was nothing in their histories to inspire them. So it was like a tabula rasa. They came to be filled with all kinds of new ideas. They could not even see the gold. So we have, and I say it all the time, we live in Ghana, people are poor, and somebody comes in with not even a suitcase, a Ghana must go bag. And then within months, they are prosperous. Give them a year. So how are they able to see all this wealth that is before us that we cannot see, okay? And just before COVID, Forbes magazine had published an article on the richest man who ever lived. And guess who was this richest man who ever lived? Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa, the emperor of Old Mali. It is said that when he visited Cairo, after he left, when he was there was such a huge inflation, okay? Because he traveled with caravans of gold, was being distributed. There may be nice stories, but it is good to inspire people, to make them know that you have done it before, you can do it again. So I'm not calling out for a Mansa Musa museum or something like that. But so what are these, not just stories, practices from the African past that can inspire futures? You know, it's very, very important that we do that, because you are denigrated throughout your childhood. You get a European doll, you get this, you are nothing, you created nothing, you know. So I think there's one of these negritude things to those whose ancestors created nothing, right? You know, so it saps away at your self-confidence, and it is important to go back to those histories. And for me, they are not destinations. You're not going to lock yourself up in that room, but it's a necessary point of departure to know about these intellectual histories and traditions and how to recuperate them. That the meanings of Timbuktu book was one of them. You know, these kinds of necessary projects where you begin to be inspired in those times and to take off, to move to the future. Let me just link it up to, so Geraldine was asking, how would an African university reconnected to its past look like? Let's start with the buildings, okay? I was telling you over breakfast, when I come to Legon campus these days, all I see are these glass structures. Just doesn't make sense. We're talking about climate change. We are the university. What kind of example are we setting to the population? This is a hilly campus. There's a lot of, you know, breezes and things like that. And we are blocking ourselves in these kinds of things and having to put on air conditioning all the time. The traditional houses, they make them of mud bricks. They are Takpami. There's a group in northern Togo who make them. How have we even looked at those kinds of designs and tried to improve on them? Because they're very environmentally friendly. They use local materials, all of those kinds of things. So there are any number of ways, including even the architecture, you know. Takaka was talking about institutional cultures, all kinds of things. How do we do some of these things? So there are some low-hanging things that we could look at. The African classics, where are African classics? You're trying to find even books for your children and your grandchildren. They're not there, you know. How do universities consciously promote these things? I know that Dina is standing on me, but I just want to go back to the question of Arabic as source. Simon, you know you know about Ajami? Yes. So Ajami script is a local script from the Arabic. In my institute, we have some of these Ajami scripts, okay? So there are some of these source materials that are lying around that we don't even know. And they collected some of them from families in Tamale and Salaga and those places, you know. And now, in many of these places, these things are just getting lost, if they even exist, you know. So those kinds of issues about sources, what do we know about our histories, what was going on, etc., that we travel to Kew Gardens or the Museum of Man or Animal in Paris or something to go and do research. Some of these, apart from the people themselves, you know, the caves, all the artifacts. But we need to grapple with these kinds of things because they won't last forever. And we need to challenge this. So like you say, how do you move palava from chata, palava sauce? So at the end of it, you make the palava sauce and you settle the problem. To really serious and important concepts, you know, and practices that we can build on. So instead of thinking that, oh, when ADR, alternative dispute resolution, you fly people from Africa to go somewhere to learn about alternative dispute resolution, when it's sitting there right in front of you, you know. So those are points of connection, of recuperation, but I agree with you that we can't go back into some comfortable past, you know, because I also have a problem. African humanity, we are as cruel as anybody. We look at what we do to children and things like that, you know. So what is it of this past? What is the usable past? What are the ones that we don't want, that we will reject, and all of those things? So it's a question of balance, of sifting, but it's a very conscious and deliberative act.
Thank you. Thank you. If you can.
Okay.
Around creativity and response, yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Prof. Premesh, for the comments and the question. Traveling theories of Edward Said, how to think that in light of, or at least in conjunction with, theory by analogy that Mamdani talked about. I think they are not mutually exclusive, as you already indicated, because what is the point of theory anyway? The point of theory is to help us to understand phenomena, to have an adequate perspective on reality. I would want to imagine that thinking about traveling theory would lead us to try to understand the value of experience. And that experience is something that, insofar it is human, is shareable across generations and across traditions and societies. But thinking about theory by analogy should lead us to understand the possibility that theories create positive outcomes as well as negative outcomes. And depending on the kind of outcome, our ability to contemplate reality might be stunted or at least enhanced. So that would be my own way of trying to balance the claims of both ideas. But the main thing I think that comes out of that is to say that how was it possible that African scholars, scholars from the periphery, produced people like Edward Said, people like Mamdani, most of you, the generations that actually we can still see today and the generations that made them. I think that there is a very important thing we must underscore, which is the critical importance of conversation amongst Africans themselves, because that is how you create your own questions and your own way of, bringing the stories of your society to the table of, the festivity of mankind. So I think that African scholars are, to a certain extent, in conversation with each other today, but the conditions are such that the way the conversation happens leads to certain problems. Is an intense contestation for distinction, achievement, acquiring symbols of esteem and all that kind of thing. So in the end, the quality of what is going on is not really there. So finally, to talk about creativity and how to reconnect with the past. Well, they said this one, we have to do disputation. So Andre, you must allow me to dispute. Yes. So the point is not that there is no value in the past. In fact, can we really think of the past in relation to Africa? Because the past is always with us. It's just like talking about modernity and tradition. Can modernity ever happen without incorporating aspects of tradition? So that's not my point. My point is not to say abandon the past. Even if you abandon your past, it will be with you, either in the form of the denial, or if you affirm it, in the form of affirmation. So there is no way you can run away from your past, because human beings, to be persons, our personhood is socially constituted. And the social constitution of personhood is a distinctive achievement that we need tools to arrive at. You need those in certain societies, we call them traditional. You need the tools of rituals, tools of practices, coming of age, initiation into different things. Well, I don't know what modern society offers us. Maybe cell phone, TikTok, and there is that other thing that has a bed, as the symbol. I don't know why they have a bed anyway as the symbol of the thing. So maybe social media and all those guys. I don't know the tools really that so-called modern society offers us to be persons, to become people, because personhood is socially constructed. And you see that the anxieties we have as a result of this lack of clearly defined tools that can help us to become persons is at the root of our problems with connecting with the past, in the interest of creating a future we can all desire. Let me stop here for now, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'd really, really like, Thabo, because you're in a position of creating a research institute, right, which is sort of central to many of our practices and our modes of creativity as authors, in a sense, of what the university might be, to also please respond. Thank you.
Yeah. So, since we are in the formation stages, we are struggling also with a lot of things. One, your requested institutional affiliation that comes with certain requests. If you're going to be under that department, this is how we do things. So we are grappling with all of these requirements. But this reminds me of the conversation which Salim was having yesterday here about language. And when Andre, you're talking about the forms of excavating what may not have got a shot at, this knowledge system. So it seems we even agree about things which should happen. We simply agree, okay, this language, we can actually develop it. Yes, actually, we even have the resources to develop the language. Then somehow, 15 years later, we all are looking at one another. We have not done anything about it. So, to get to what you're talking about in relation to hanging fruits, there are really certain things which can be done if we just decide and be deliberate about it and take decisions to, for example, like language and what he was raising in relation to sources, teaching and learning. And for me, I think these are things maybe within the network that we can deliberate on, and those who have the capacity to do certain things, they can take certain actions within institutions to do something about where we are, to move at least an inch. In the research center, I think we can contribute with research, and hence my engagement with the network to see what I can learn and how we can better position ourselves moving forward to contribute to the excavation you're talking about. I'm always shocked at, I think it was, who raised it, was talking about slaughtering of animals and, and how people keep one eye closed, and then tomorrow they wake up to protest about animal rights and all of that. But so the same with what Africans don't talk about. Most Africans follow a dual system of religion. So on Sunday they go to the church, someone is a pastor, and then on Monday the Sangoma comes in to slaughter the cow. So there is the formal religion and then the informal one. So, and this is a professor, and we don't say anything about it. We just know this is how it works. And then we say, how do we excavate these knowledges? These are people we know, they are in our communities. We can invest and study these knowledges and pull them out. So I think these are some of maybe the things through the research center, some of the projects we can set up. I mean, I don't know, if a Sangoma introduced him or herself at the gate, how would he be treated in comparison to a bishop at this university? Yes. So, yeah, so we need to really, there are certain things, because it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to disappear. That religion is going to be there, whether you want it in the curtain, but it will be there in the curtain. Whether you want to bring it in the light, but it will always be there.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Last night while walking, yesterday while walking, Simon and I were talking about the techno-rationality and the roots of rationality in terms of the external referent of the Western University, and it's pulling away from ideas of God or superstition or whatever to science. And perhaps we should be asking some questions about that external referent and how it informs the African university. But Takyiwaa, would you like to finish off? You don't have a lot of time, but it's quite nice. You're at an exciting point of thinking about your university as it's conceived and facing all the challenges we've been speaking. So I think it would be a really nice way to end the session.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much. I would like to focus on Ayanda's question on how do we support indigenous knowledge systems as critical university studies, just some ideas that I might have. I think sometimes confronting all the challenges that we have in higher education is sometimes very overwhelming. It just seems like there's just so much going on that almost nothing can be done to actually transform it. But I also like to think about like the little steps that we can take that are very doable and can still make a difference in slowly making that change. So I mean, some of the ideas that I thought about, for example, I think one of the challenges that comes with trying to bring in indigenous knowledge into formal education is that it's simply under-theorized. There's few materials available for teachers to use. So one activity could even be to create a textbook. So can we create something with like lesson plans in it, something very practical that teachers can use in their classroom, and at least a step towards figuring out how to practically bring indigenous knowledge. And another idea is like even pilot lessons. So maybe it's hard to create, it takes a lot of energy to create a whole course or a whole program, but can we even start with a lesson, like one lesson in class that incorporates indigenous knowledge or centers indigenous knowledge, try it out, and then teachers share. This is how it went, this is what went well, this is what, where the challenges are. And then another aspect is being able to speak to the stewards of the indigenous knowledge. So I have a colleague of mine in Uganda who does really interesting work on music, on indigenous music, and what he does is he tries to find people who are basically the last people who know about these indigenous music traditions and are the stewards of this knowledge. So he goes and works with them, learns from them, and also trains young people to be able to learn that knowledge. So I think being able to identify who those people are, working together with them to be able to record, document it, and figure out how to apply it. But I think that there's just so many opportunities available also for collaboration, even comparative studies. So for example, maybe somebody in Tanzania collaborating with somebody in South Africa, looking at a certain field and the indigenous practices in their area, and then also in a different country. So these are just some practical ideas that I have in mind that are small steps towards transforming the system overall. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's give a big round of applause to our panelists. Thank you all for your contributions, and I'm sure you're going to be swamped over lunch. I wanted to ask, I'm sure you've seen the exhibition that is set up in the front. these have been carefully selected and specifically brought in as part of this colloquium. And I hope that people have looked at the images. I think almost all of them were composed by students as part of projects. And so to make sure that we engage with those as a contribution to this symposium, we've asked the project coordinator to speak briefly. Terry Lucia, would you come for a bit and talk to us about it? You can have the tall box.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, the idea is just to give you a little bit of context because the exhibition on its own doesn't provide that really. So this is Leslie Ngazira. At the back there, there's Chiamo Morwe as well. Chiamo is from the University of Venda. I'm working at the HSRC. And Leslie, at the time when we did the research, was a former student activist at Durban University of Technology. So what we see outside is one of the results, one of the outcomes of a photo voice project. And during the book launch tomorrow morning, we're going to talk a little bit more about photo voice as a research method, as a participatory action research method, and also show some of the other things that come out of it. There are 3 boards. Those photo boards. Among those photo boards, there are 3 that give a little bit of context. The one talks about who was participating in the project. The other one talks about the project itself. And the third one, actually the third ones are theme boards. So there are several of those because you will always find that the photos are a bit themed. So the most important thing I think to say is that number 1, just guard yourself when you're looking at the exhibition. There are some photos in the exhibition that can be very triggering. And we didn't put up any sign like that, but I think being a student or a staff member in a South African university in Techno-Rational Times is an experience of violence. And some of the pictures actually depict those violences in various ways. And it is indeed actually because of seeing the effect of that violence on student activists during an earlier part of the research project Into Fees Must Fall that we realized we need to do a project like this, that addresses specifically issues of violence and their impact on well-being. What is the second thing that I'm supposed to say? Okay, maybe another just quick thing. So the photos, all the photos there are actually curated from a much larger set of pictures, over 100 pictures that were generated in the process of this photo voice research. This exhibition was specifically curated to be an exhibition that can travel around, and hence it only includes about a quarter of all the photos. And what you will see when you're looking at a board is a photo, and then there's a little bit of a narrative to it. So the narrative actually is by the photo, and the narrative is by a student who came into a photo voice workshop, brought a particular photo, and then explained why he or she would bring, why they would bring this photo and how this actually reflects an experience of violence or an experience of well-being in the context of the Fees Must Fall student movement. And that was then written up into about 1 or 2 paragraphs. So these are also then that particular student's words. So this is why I bring this photo. So just that you understand what you're actually seeing, if this is the first time you're seeing that. So Leslie, you've been part of the process in a particular way. In 4 cases of universities, we did it face-to-face as workshops where we came together, and then COVID came. I just want him to very briefly just also say a few words about the process at DUT perhaps, and yeah, where you are.
Sanbona, Tumela, Mulweni, how's everyone? Guys, it's been a very interesting project that we had at Durban University of Technology. All of us, we know that not all universities were covered in the process of the fee struggle, and we really acknowledge the project that the Human Science Research Council came with, because to me it dig deep. It dig deep, and it informs the untold story of various institutions that the same event happened. I mean, if you compare the story of VETS, if you compare the story of University of Cape Town, if you compare the story of some elite, most highly ranked universities, same activities happen within the low-ranked activities, low-ranked universities. In DUT, for instance, our university, it's one of the brightest universities that unveiled one of the brightest young men called Bonginkosi Kanyile, the Fees Must Fall activist, a stone man. That's how we call him. Because all of us were aware that he was able to make police to run away with the stone that he carried in his hand, just to make sure that students are not suppressed, and also to make sure that students do not attend the class when others are protesting outside for their rights, when others were protesting outside for the fees to not go up. So I think this is a very interesting and also a good exhibition that will be more informative to you, and also that will be able to dig deep in giving you more analysis of other campuses and the role of other students that they played in various institutions and challenges that they came across. Some people like us, we spend 6 months wearing one T-shirt in campus. I spent 6 months wearing one trouser. I spent 6 months wearing one shoe and carrying one bag in the university. You would imagine that I was coming from Northwest Province, studying in KZN as a Tswana-speaking student. You'd imagine when the campus had to be closed because of you were part of the disruptors, you were part of the activists whom stood up and said enough is enough. We're not going to fold hands when we are shown a middle finger. We're not going to fold hands when fees are going up, when the residence where we have to sleep, fees are going to also go up. When the food that we must eat in campus, the fees are going to go up. When the cost of living in campuses rise, and we fold hands as the student movement leaders, we fold hands as student activists and say, it must be just a normal business. We compromised our time to study, fighting for the children of the working class and the poor. We spent time not sleeping. I spent 6 months not eating a cooked meal, but I was eating igwinya. It's an African, they call it a Zulu burger. Igwinya, it's a big burger. Inside you only put it bologna and cheese. So for 6 months, If you are going to see my pictures, you'll feel sorry for me. And you'll be shocked if this is me. Are you alive, Leslie? But we made it out of all those circumstances. We are still standing tall, and we're encouraging that as we were the generation that were inspired by the 1976 class, we also rose from the ashes. We played our role, we played our part in ensuring that today, the next generation will enjoy the free education that we did not enjoy, but we fought for. So we are encouraging also the techno-rational generation that must come and stand firm in defending their position to ensure that our institutions are also developed in the right time and space and logic of our economic development and also the infrastructure development that is still lacking in our institution to accommodate a number of matric students that are coming from various high schools. Thank you very much. Amandla!
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. The only problem with that discussion of the burger is that we are also getting really hungry and about to have lunch. If I can just ask for a few more minutes, Andre would like to speak to us about a number of things, including, importantly, a photograph to document our coming together.
Oh, yeah. You guys were very productive on the stage, eh? Okay, I've got a phone here. Just to apologize, we're running slightly late. We have a bit of a challenge here with our kitchen, so our lunch will be served at 1:30. So that's the first apology. But of course, it gives us now time. As you may well know, it doesn't take a short time to get a photo going with a group of people like this. So we can then use, say, the next 10 to 15 minutes to. Jen, would you like the participants to congregate this side? Yeah, just here on my left, and we'll take a group photograph so that you can all, in the context of the Managerialist University, confirm that you have been here and account for your absence from your workplace. Okay, right, just here on the left, and then we will then reconvene at 2:00. So we will have half an hour. We will have a longer break, but we will have half an hour for lunch. And the reason for that is that we also have to link up with colleagues online, in different time zones so that the program can continue as planned, okay? So we reconvene at 2:00, okay? Thank you so much.